Have you tried slow stitching, but you don't know what to do with it when it's finished? Let me help. I'll show how you can take a simple rectangle shape, add a fabric patchwork collage, cover it in slow stitching, and then transform your stitched piece into something functional and beautiful. There are so many options, and I'm going to show you just a few. So come and follow along as I stitch a rectangle to make a mini book. I'm also going to give all the details to show how, with a few tweaks, you can create multiple alternate projects, all starting with the humble rectangle as a base. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. The rectangle that I'm working on today is 3 inches by 6 inches. I've created a collage of fabrics and I've basted them down with sewing thread. If you want a more in-depth look at how I got to this point, I'm going to link to a video where I show how to create a fabric collage. So this is my collage of fabrics. I've got some golden yellows, oranges, a bit of pink, and some green. And I've got all those colors in a pattern fabric that has a brown background. So the first thing that I want to do is pull out some colors of embroidery floss that match the colors in my collage. So I have pulled out a golden yellow color, I've pulled out a green color, and I've pulled out a melon pink color, a dark and a light. So these are the colors I'm going to start with, and I can always bring in more or change my mind about the colors I've chosen. But this gives me somewhere to start. So the first thing I want to do is surround my patchwork pieces with stitching, and that's going to secure them down, and it's going to add the first layer of color and texture. I'm going to be using 2 strands of embroidery floss, and I'm going to be using an embroidery needle. I like using these gold eye embroidery needles, and they come in a set sizes 3 to 9. The other needle that I often use with this stitching is a Millners needle, in the same sizes 3 to 9. It comes in a set. Both of these are really good for the kind of stitching that I'm going to do. So I have my 2 strands of floss. I'm starting with this darker melon color. Here's 2 strands, and this is the 6 strands altogether. So you can see that if you used all 6 strands, that's going to make a thicker line. And I find that the 2 strands works perfectly for my type of stitching. So I have my thread on my embroidery needle, and I'm going to create a quilter's knot. And that's where I point the thread towards the sharp side of the needle. I pinch down with my fingers and I use my other hand to twist the thread around and make a knot. I hold on to that knot and pull all the way to the bottom, and that's my quilter's knot. So now I'm going to surround my patchwork pieces with stitching to secure them down. So I take stitches that are a comfortable distance for me, and then I turn and go back and I place stitches in between that first row that I created. I'm going to use up all the floss that I have on this thread, so I'm going to travel around and I'm going to surround several pieces of fabric working in this corner. So I continue to move across my piece, creating these stitches that are going to hold down the fabric. I'm going to work all the way to the edge, turn and go back, and finish stitching in this melon color. So I'm going to end up surrounding several pieces in this color. So I'm continuing here with this dark melon color, surrounding quite a few pieces with that stitching. So you can see that it's all over the piece. So now I'm looking at what I've stitched, I'm evaluating it, and what's drawing my eye is that solid piece of pink, and I want to bring in another piece of fabric to break that up a bit. So I've pulled out a small piece of green. It's a triangular shape. I already have a triangular shape over on the right, so it's nice to repeat that shape again. I just have to find the placement that I like, and then I'm going to stitch that on. Now, one thing that can happen is you can find that as you've stitched, there may be a piece of fabric that's started to pucker or pull in a direction you don't want. So all I'm going to do to fix that is to clip some of those basting stitches on the back, and that's going to loosen that piece up and I can reposition it. So now I'm going to continue in the areas where I haven't stitched. I'm going to stitch on the piece I've added and finish this first layer. So now I've come in with the green floss and I've finished stitching down all my pieces of fabric. One thing I notice is that dark melon color is showing up quite a bit more than the green. So that's an interesting contrast. I'm folding my piece in half because I do have in mind that I may fold this piece when I've completed all the stitching. So I'm just taking a look at that. So sometimes it's a good idea to step away and come back with fresh eyes. So I'm going to do that now. So I've decided that I want more green, but I want it to be lighter. So I have this piece of fabric that is a really bright yellow-green color, and I'm placing it behind my stitching, and I feel like that really brightens things up. I want to add it in a few spots. There's yellow in the piece and there's green in the piece, so this is bringing in a yellow-green that coordinates really well. I don't want to add large pieces, and I'm looking at what I've got, and I see I have lots of circular shapes in that pattern fabric. So my idea is to add circles. So I'm going to snip off a really thin piece, less than 1 inch of this fabric, and then tear it. And I'm going to start cutting out some small circle or oval shapes. I'm going to place them around on this collage and see what I think about them. So I have several shapes cut out. I'm going to spend some time moving them around and placing them on top of my collage. I'm really liking the color. I think it's adding some interest and some brightness. So I think I want to add a lot of these. So I'm going to keep cutting out more and placing them around. I'm liking what I'm starting to build here, and I don't want these to fall off. So I'm going to bring out some small pins. These are applique pins. And I'm going to start pinning down each little circle and oval. So I have all of these pinned down. I think I'm going to cut out a few more and add them, and then I'm going to be ready to stitch them down. And I think at this point, I'm going to go back to my stash of floss, and I'm going to find a color that's a good match for that yellow-green. So I found this color that's really close, and I want to use that to stitch them down. And so that's not going to cause any contrast, and that's going to allow me to come in later with other colors if I want to stitch around those circles. But it's going to add some texture. It's going to make them all appear the same as the pieces that are already there because they're all stitched around all edges. So I've begun to stitch around these circles, and it's really adding a nice texture that blends them in with the background. So I'm going to continue with this color and stitch the rest of the circles on, and I may even add 1 or 2 more. So to stitch these, I'm using the same procedure that I did for my other patchwork pieces, using straight stitches, coming in perpendicular to the circles and stitching all the way around. So all my circles are stitched on now. I'm happy with the way that this is looking. So now I'm deciding what I want to do next to integrate these circles even more with the patchwork. And I'm looking at the pattern fabric that I drew inspiration from for the shapes. And I'm seeing that there is a blue-green color that's slightly different than my green fabric. So I want to pull out a floss that matches that color. So here's the color I've been stitching with, and here's the color that I've pulled out. Very, very close, but it has more blue in it, and it's a really good match for that blue-green of the pattern fabric. So I'm going to switch over to this color to stitch around these green circles. It's a very subtle difference. I'm hoping that that will integrate the entire piece even more. So I've begun to go back around some of these circles with that blue-green color. It's changed the way that they look. I'm going to fold my piece in half again and have a look at the circles and the stitching. I'm liking the way that that looks. I feel like I have a really nice base with lots of color and texture, and I'm ready to start doing some slow stitching. And I'm going to choose white for that. So here I've begun making some slow stitching lines. I decided to use pearl cotton size 8 to do my slow stitching. Pearl cotton has a beautiful twist, and it's really nice to do slow stitching with. So with the pearl cotton size 8, I use a chenille needle size 24. It's a slightly larger needle and it has a bigger eye, and it works really well with this pearl cotton size 8. So now I'm going to create more slow stitching lines. I'm going to do my lines in different directions, and I'm going to cover this whole piece. The other thing I've decided to do is to add a second color. Using the pearl cotton size 8, I've pulled out this blue-green color that's very close to the embroidery floss color that I've been using. So I'm going to alternate between using white and this blue-green color to create slow stitching lines over top of the entire piece. So here I've completed my stitching. I have a mix of the two colors. I have different directions that I've stitched in. I feel like the slow stitching is that final element that really draws everything together. So now I have a rectangular shape covered in stitching. So what else can you make with a rectangular piece of slow stitching? These drawstring pouches started with a rectangular piece. The process I used is really similar to the process here. I covered it in patchwork. I stitched everything down, I added slow stitching lines, and then I added a lining and channels for the drawstrings. And if you want to see how I make these drawstring bags, I'm going to link to that project below. These drawstring bags are so satisfying to make, and they're slightly addictive. It's very hard to just make one. I highly recommend you check that video out and make a drawstring pouch or two. These also make great gifts. There's another type of pouch that you can make from a rectangle, and I'm going to link to that project below. This is a larger pouch, and I use this one all the time to store small projects on the go, floss, and needles. This bag is also lined, and because it has felt as a base, it's a very sturdy bag that can stand up on its own. So check out that video if you want to make a larger pouch. So now that this piece of stitching is complete, I just have to decide what to do with it. There are so many options. I like the idea of folding this in half. I'm going to add a backing to this piece. So I'm taking color inspiration from these blues and greens, and I've selected a piece of turquoise batik fabric. One of the nice things about batik fabric is that it doesn't fray very easily. So I've cut a piece that's slightly larger on all sides. I have about 1/2 inch on each side to play with here. And what I'm going to do is fold up the sides right onto the front. So this is going to create a colorful border, and it's going to give a really nice clean appearance to this stitched piece. So here I've begun stitching. I've folded up the edges. I'm using clips to hold everything in place while I stitch. And this process is sometimes called self-binding, or using your backing as a binding. If you want to see this process in detail, I'm going to link to a video where I show in detail how to do this. And in that video, I'm using double gauze fabric. But in short, it involves folding up the sides twice, first to your batting and secondly right up onto the front, and clipping it in place. You can also create mitered corners that gives everything a nice crisp, clean look. So check out that video if you want a step-by-step on how to do this on one of your pieces of stitching. So I've completed adding this backing and folding it onto the front. And I'm really happy with that colorful border. I think it's really brought everything together. It's looking really good now. When I fold this in half, this looks like a beautiful little book. And I've decided I want it to be a needle book. I made a needle book in a previous video, and I will also link to that if you want to have a look on how I made that one. That needle book doesn't have any pages inside, and instead I've added fabric and felt on the inside. For this one, I think I want to add several pages into the middle and stitch them in. So I've chosen some golden yellow felt, and I've cut 2 pieces slightly smaller than my stitched piece. I can see when I fold them here, that's going to make a nice fat book. I've chosen that matching floss from the beginning of the project, and I'm going to stitch these pages in place. You may want to have some clips to hold everything in place as you stitch. And this book is small enough that I don't think I'm going to need them here. But what I think I do want to do here is I want to mark the center. So I've got a Frixion Erasable pen here. I'm going to fold my piece and make some marks in both corners. And then when that's done, I'm going to come in with a ruler and I'm going to draw a line right down the center. I'm going to do the same thing with my pieces of felt. So you can see my line on my fabric and on my felt, and that's going to help me place everything exactly where I want it so that I stitch everything evenly. So what I do is I place my first piece of felt on my fabric, and I'm going to come in with my knot underneath. I'm going to stitch right up at the corner, and then I'm going to come around. I'm going to stitch right through all the layers there. I can keep double checking. I can make sure that everything continues to be lined up each time I take a stitch. I've taken that small stitch that's going to show on the outside. Make sure everything's lined up, and then I'm going to take a longer stitch on the inside of the book, right through the felt, all the way through to my cover, and then come back in with a small stitch, continuing to make sure that everything's lined up, and I'm going to stitch all the way to the bottom. As long as I take it slow and I keep checking that I'm still lined up, this is going to go very smoothly. So I'm almost at the bottom here, and then I'm going to come out inside through the felt, and then I'm going to bring out my second piece and place it on top. Line everything up and use those lines that I have, holding it there with my thumb, and I'm going to come through, and I'm going to stitch all the way down the same way I did with the first page. I'm going to go all the way through to my cover, take a small stitch, go back inside, and take a larger stitch. When I say larger, it's probably about 1/4 of an inch long on the inside. Go through that center line, make sure I'm coming all the way to that same spot in my cover, and work my way all the way down to the bottom. When I get to the bottom, I'm going to fold back that felt. I'm going to take a stitch through that turquoise piece. I'm going to create a knot, and that's just because I want to hide the knot as much as possible there. And then I'm going to bury my thread, travel it along, bury it in the fabric there, and then snip it off. So there are my pages stitched into my book. I'm going to close my book and take a look at everything is looking nice. It's a nice fat book with those pages. I'm going to turn them and fold them over. You can see that each page is stitched in nicely there. I can turn those pages. It's looking really good. Now, in my previous video where I made a needle book, I made a closure where I added a button on the front. So that's an option here too. But I think I really like this the way it is. It's a fatter book. I'm going to be able to put more things in it. And I think I want to just leave it as it is without a closure. So I've added some pins and needles to my book. I've even added a piece I've previously stitched, a tiny little square, and I've sewn that into one of the pages. I'm really happy with the way that this project turned out. So as you can see, the humble rectangle has so many possibilities for your slow stitching. You don't even necessarily have to decide at the beginning what you want to do with your project. The only difference in these different projects is the size that you start with. When it comes to a bag or a pouch, it's going to be more functional if you start with a larger size, but you can even make really small bags. They can be really nice gifts. You can really do anything that you want. So I hope you found this helpful and it's given you some ideas about what you can do with your slow stitching. Whether it's a bag or a book or a needle pouch, there's so many ways that you can go with this. If you have any other ideas about what could be made with a rectangle, put them in the comments below. I'd love to hear your ideas. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope this has given you some inspiration about projects that you can make with your stitching. Thank you so much for joining me today. Until next time, happy stitching.